All right, next we're going to look a little bit more at the winery winemaking process. So we have harvest and pre-fermentation processing. As you can see, this is from Napa Valley College, and they go over some really good things in this presentation. We'll talk a little bit more about harvest. We've already talked about it, but review isn't bad, and there are a few points that can be made in here as well. We'll talk about white and red wine grapes and some of the differences and skin contact time. And so here you can see a manual harvest operation. It doesn't require any special buckets, but there are some that are more ergonomically designed, more comfortably designed than just your standard 5-gallon bucket. But there's different ways to do it, but they all fall within a relatively similar pattern. So I've already talked about logistics. There's a lot going on for the vineyard manager, and they've got a lot of different blocks and only so many trucks, so many harvest crews. There's just a lot of things that all have to be lined up in a row to have a steady rhythm of activity throughout harvest on all of your blocks. And complicating that with the fact that the grapes are going to be ready when they're ready. They're not going to wait or hurry up because of your issues. The grapes are going to be ready when they're ready. And so sometimes you have to hold grapes a little bit longer than you would like, or harvest them maybe a tad earlier than you would like, just because you have no choice. You only have so much equipment, so many people, so long of a window. Maybe a rain event is forecast that's going to be a disaster next week. We just had rain here where I am last night that was pretty hard. Now, harvest is over everywhere I'm familiar with. I don't know if anybody got hit by it, but if it was a few weeks ago, it could have been a big problem for some people. And then another complication, the winery itself. The winery has to accept grapes with a certain rhythm. They only have so much space for trucks coming in and getting onto the crush pad, so there is a line to bring the grapes and deliver them to the crush pad at the winery. And once they're delivered to the crush pad, there's only so much capacity to handle those grapes at any given winery. And occasionally, sometimes a winery has to say, we need to divert that. We need to call up one of our competitors or cooperators and say, can you take an extra 20,000 pounds of grapes? We're at max and we got too many grapes coming in. Can you crush a few for us and work out a deal? But logistics is a huge deal. And if you're good at logistics, you always have a job in agriculture. I have talked to many farm managers, and many of them have defined their jobs more like a traffic cop than an expert in growing crops. They're they are logistics experts. And logistics experts are all about getting other people doing the right thing in the right time. So there's lots going on. All of this has to be dealt with at the same time. A lot of different containers. These are some medium-sized containers. Certainly, you don't want to use too large of a container. The larger the container, the more weight or pressure on the berries at the bottom of the container. And so you can reduce that pressure or damage by having shallower containers and maybe stacking the containers. You don't want to have to transfer grapes too much. Anytime you're damaging grapes, that you're exposing the juice to oxygen, and the chemicals in the juice don't like reacting with oxygen. You're also exposing the insides of the grapes and the juice to bacteria and fungi that really want to feed on that wonderful sugar. And so you want to minimize damage, minimize transfer from one container to another to keep it to a minimum. Containers need to be watertight. You don't want your juice dripping out the bottom. And they also have to be containers that are going to work not only for the winery, or excuse me, for the vineyard operation and out in the field, but also once they get to the winery has the equipment and facilities that can handle those containers. They have to be an appropriate size and shape for dumping into the crush pad or however they're going to be handled. So again, here you can see machine harvest on the left-hand side, hand harvest on the right. Again, different types of harvest with different types of containers, different issues going on. So once you create some sort of a transfer of berries from the vine to a small container to a medium-sized container, then that container is taken out of the field and stacked onto a truck. Are you going to do another transfer, or is this medium-sized container directly stackable on the truck? That's ideal rather than having another transfer. But in that process, you certainly have to weigh them, and you can weigh them at different points. You just have to have some way to put the weight on each of the containers, and then a truckload gets weighed, and then it goes to processing. But you need the weights to be recorded as they're coming out of the field or as they're leaving the vineyard property. And again, how much detail do you keep? That's up to the grower. This is a bin dumper operation, and this forklift bin dumper is just one way to do this. If you're using a modest size container, then this device actually pivots. And so you can see the forklift pointing in this direction, and this is a hydraulic pivot point. So the bin is grabbed by the hydraulic arms of this bin dumper and then pivoted to pour it into the crush pad. So large winery receiving equipment would have much larger devices. These are machine harvested dumpers. You can see the device here being pulled by a tractor, and it's on a pivot already. So you've got this larger bin that is going to be dumped into the crush pad when it gets there. Crushing and destemming, or destemming and crushing. I mean, what are you going to do? Again, we've already talked about the different ways of doing certain steps, but here you can see another machine. This is actually doing the destemming, and you can see the stems coming out with very, very little juice that ends up getting lost. Just a bit of moisture, not a lot of juice getting lost into the destemming process. There are smaller operations that can be used. Again, there's lots of different equipment. Here you can see a modest size destemmer that's been disassembled, and so the grapes are going to go through this central part. Any of the berries will fall through. Any of the rachis material, the stems as they call them, in the winery side are going to get caught up and moved through the device and discarded. From a destemmer operation, they go to a must pump. And keep in mind, I didn't mention this a second ago, but I mentioned it in one of the previous PowerPoints. You might leave some stems in. You might do some fermentation on the stems for a period and then destem it later. There's no magic in terms of this is the exact order of how you make wine. Lots of choices. But once you have the crushed grapes, what is a crushed grape? It is a mixture of skin, seed, pulp, and juice. And we call that the must. The must. That's a word that a lot of people find odd because we use the word must very differently in common English language. But there is the word must as a noun that is the freshly crushed grape juice with skin, pulp, and seeds. And so there's a special pump that is designed to move this slurry of a mixture of solids and liquids. Some pumps work great for pure liquids, lighter liquids. So for example, the pump that pumps gasoline into your gas tank works great for the thin fluid called gasoline or diesel. Might have a problem pumping thicker fluids. It probably would. So if I was trying to pump a mixture of pudding, for example, through a pump that is used for gasoline, it might have a serious problem. I guarantee you it's going to have a problem if there are solids in there, like bits of skin and pulp and seeds. And so there are specially designed pumps, and there's no magic engineering. There are lots of pumps that are really good at moving a slurry mixture of solids and liquids. They're just designed differently than pumps that are designed for pure liquids. So here's some examples of must pumps, and you can see how the corkscrew internal design allows them to pump very efficiently, and solids can move through this corkscrew without clogging, unlike some piston pumps or other types of designs that are ideal for other materials. Again, it's just a simple engineering problem. You notice that in a winery, they are often on these wheeled carts. They are usually on wheeled carts, and you can move them around very easily. The control panel here to operate the pump, and you can see this one little hole on the side. This is where you would connect a hose. There would be another hose connection, one being the intake, one being the outtake, and the pump can then have the liquid solid mixture, the must, pumped from one tank to the next, whatever container you have. This is a screw pump, a different style, an open style, as opposed to the closed lobe pump. I'm not going to ask you the names. I won't ask you to identify the pumps. I just would ask you to know that there are must pumps specifically designed for wine must, which contains solids. So what about the white grapes? Fermentation is not carried out on the skins and seeds like the red wine. You get them out very quickly. You separate the juice from the skins and seeds. There's still some solids. A lot of the pulp ends up making it through the process of removing skins and seeds, but the skins and seeds is not what you want. You want to get that away because skins and seeds are going to give you unwanted flavors, unwanted cloudiness components, chemicals that will get into your wine that will turn it cloudy and ruin the clarity and color characteristics that you want in a nice, clean, crisp white wine. Even though there's a wide range of flavor components you're after, for a true white wine, you don't want those skins and seeds. Skins have high concentrations of phenols. We'll look at that at a later time. And these phenols add pigment and flavors that are not desirable in typical white wine grape fermentation products. Oxygen reacts with the phenols to produce brown pigments. That's Brown is not good for white wine, and there are enzymes in the wine. Enzymes are special protein catalysts that cause chemical reactions to occur, and because wine is a living thing, though juice is a living thing, even though we're killing the cells, the biological enzymes are still there. And some of the cells early on are still alive. They're still doing their thing. And if you have oxygen exposed to the white wine grapes, even if the cells have all been killed, the active enzymes, the proteins that cause chemical reactions, are still active, and they will cause browning. So what do? You keep it cool. Temperatures below 10 centigrade, below 50 degrees, slows down that activity. So white wine grapes are always harvested in cool weather. If you have cool, overcast days, you can get away with harvesting a little later in the day, but often white wine grapes are harvested very early in the morning or even when it's dark out, in order to have a grape coming in that's cool and air temperature that's cool. There's a product called SO2, which is sulfur dioxide, and SO2 is a chemical that will inhibit the browning of the components in wine. And SO2 is used not only to keep the clarity of white wines and keep it from browning, but it is also used for other things. For example, if I go to something like a dried apricot images, and here you can see a beautiful golden dried apricot. They have been treated with sulfur dioxide. And this is what a lot of people think of, this beautiful orange color, golden orange color of a dried apricot. They're soft and chewy and sweet and wonderful. And some other people might see dried apricots that look like this and go, what the hell is that? That's some type of shoe leather or something. That's what dried apricots look like when they are dried without sulfur dioxide. They brown, the sugars and components, they brown as oxygen interacts with the chemicals in the apricot flesh. And you end up with a much more leathery texture, a different taste, obviously a different color and general appearance. They look drier. They are drier on the outside. They dry down differently, and you get a very different product. Now, I like both ways. I think it's a great product. Usually, I've had some bad ones, but you know, dried apricots, whether they are nice light golden orange with sulfur treatment, I love those, or they're kind of a brownish leathery non-sulfur treated apricot. They are also just, it's a different experience. It's a different food. It's like saying, you know, do you like chocolate or vanilla? They're completely different kinds of things. You do get apricot flavors. Either way, there is some similarities, but they still are very different products. So I think that's a good example of sulfur dioxide used in white wine. You can see it dramatically when we look at the impact of sulfur dioxide on the apricots. So whole clusters, you can take whole clusters and crush and press them, or you can press the clusters straight. Take hand harvested clusters and put them straight in the press and press them on the rachis. It's just a different experience that the berries are going through, having the whole cluster pressed versus pre-crushing them, which is going to separate the grapes from the rachis. Usually you'll also destem if you're crushing and pressing. During the crush process, you'll probably have a destemming process, but not necessarily. And then you press to get the juice out. There is another process, I'm not going to get into it, you could read about it if you want, called hyperoxidation. And hyperoxidation is going to be intentionally oxidizing your phenols in a way that causes them to join together, to polymerize together before you ferment them. And it's another way to get them out of your product. You're forcing them into a long chain that's going to be easier to deal with later. If you get oxidation after fermentation, that is going to hurt your wine quality for sure. So oxygen, very important, and the impact of oxygen is different if I'm talking about before fermentation or after fermentation. After is never something you can deal with. So here's that SO2, the sulfur dioxide. It is your friend, especially in white wines. It does kill microbes, and some microbes are a potential problem. I'm not really worried about fungus in my wine. They're going to die. During fermentation, they're going to die. But there are some bacteria that can actually hijack your fermentation process and start making vinegar instead of wine. That's bad. Especially if you've got a 150,000 gallon tank and it starts turning vinegar. You got some problems. So SO2 helps not only kill the bacteria that could hijack or take over or ruin your fermentation process, but it's deactivating the enzymes. It's acting as a sponge to the oxygen that's there. And so it really is a beneficial product. Now, some people can be sensitive to SO2. In my experience, there are a lot of people who have claimed sensitivity to SO2 just because they think of it as unnatural. It's an additive. I'm adding something that I shouldn't be adding to a product. You know, look at those natural apricots. They're brown and wonderful, and those orange ones are a sign of some sort of industrial, artificial manufacturing process. It's evil, bad, go away. And there's a mental block against the sulfur dioxide compound. In reality, we need sulfur, we need oxygen, and very few people are really sensitive to sulfur dioxide. It's not something that most people would react to. Far more people say they don't like it than actually have a problem with it. But there are some people, they do have a problem with it. They have a negative reaction. Anyway, not going to get into that any further. With the red grapes, you get the color from the skin. If you've ever cut open a red grape or eaten red grapes and you don't pop the whole thing in your mouth, you just take a bite and you'll notice that the internal flesh looks like a white wine grape. There's no color in it. The color is in the skin. And so in order to get the red color from the grape, the red wine grapes, you have to leave the skin there for a period of time. If you end up taking the skins away on a red grape and you don't ferment it at all, you will end up with a white wine from a red grape, like white Zinfandel. Now, white Zinfandel, the Zinfandel is a red grape. It's not pure white, it's actually a blush. And how much off color? You're going to get a little bit of color if you're using the grapes, but very, very little. There's just a hint of pink that you get on some of these red grapes where the skins have been removed prior to fermentation. And a lot of people like that. I love a white Zinfandel. It has some of the wonderful characteristics of the Zinfandel grape, which I enjoy. And for some situations, a Zinfandel red wine might be a little heavier than I want, and the white Zin is just a nice, refreshing, pleasant experience. And when I was broke, moved out of my parents' house when I first moved out, and here I am, you know, just barely out of high school, living in an apartment with a friend of mine, and the only thing we could afford for wine was Sutter Home White Zinfandel. And Sutter Home was trying to make a quality wine at the time at a bargain price, and they nailed it. They were trying to get a reputation as being a quality wine, and get away from what the perception that they were just kind of a box wine, cheap wine kind of a company. And they got off the ground producing some cheap wines, but that white Zinfandel became a real home run for them. And now Sutter Home is very well respected, and I helped them out as much as I could back in those ancient days with, you know, the $3 bottles of white Zinfandel. Go Sutter Home. Anyway, the clusters are destemmed and crushed and pumped to the tank. Again, that's common. Can you adjust things? Yeah, you certainly can. Stems may be added back 20 to 40%, depending on what you want. Remember, you've got the stem process, but that's how this operation is. Do you completely destem and then add back? Well, again, it depends on the operation. Some small operations might crush the entire whole clusters, not crush, press the entire whole clusters and start fermentation, stems, seeds, skins, and all. It's all your choice. Anyway, a saugny, I believe that's how you say it. A saugny or bleed may be done to concentrate the skin juice ratio. So blush or rosé wines may be made from the saugny, because what have you done? You've taken away juice from the must, and so you're left with a higher percentage of the skins and a lower percentage of juice. So you're going to get a more intense color. So what are you going to do with that bleed that you've taken off? What are you going to do with that juice? Make a blush wine. If you leave all of the juice in, maybe you're not going to get the quality that, or the characteristics that you're after. You're not going to get as intense of a color, intense of a skin flavor. So if you really want those skin flavors and you really want that color to be high, doing a bleed is one way to do it, where you're literally taking the must of the red wine, bleeding off some of the juice before you even go any further, and then now you have a more concentrated, higher skin to juice ratio, higher amounts of the flavors and colors from the skin. And the bleed, all right, you can make your blush or rosé wine. Skin contact, whole grapes and reds. Certainly the time that you allow the skin to stay in contact with the grapes during fermentation, with the juice, I should say, during fermentation, is very important. Now, it depends on what you're making, your product, the style of fermentation, the varietal character that you're after. The longer you leave the skins, the more intense the varietal flavors and characteristics are going to come through in the finished wine. You overdo it and it can be overpowering. The tastes are not what you want. So you need to find the right balance. How much of the varietal character do I want without going too far? And in my experience, you want, for some of the reds, you want a easier to drink, more generally acceptable red wine with a higher broad consumer base, bulk wine, things like that. You're going to leave the skins on a little less time. You tend to be more to the less time, so you don't overpower with some of the flavors. And again, that depends on the variety. For some very specific wines, high-end wines, wines that are being made for a specific purpose, you might want to push that up a bit. You might want to get more of those varietal characteristics. So you get about 2.5 grams of phenolic compounds for every kilogram of material, of must, in your reds, and about 0.2 to 0.5 grams per kilogram of phenolics in your whites. Phenolics are divided into 3 categories that we'll talk about. The anthocyanins give color. The tannins give astringency. That's kind of a dryness feel in the mouth. And the flavor, what they call flavor, is catechins. 3 major categories of these phenolic ring compounds. And there's a variety within each category. It's not like there is a chemical called anthocyanin. There are a number of different, very similar chemicals that are anthocyanins. They're all similar, but not the same. And they're tannins and catechins. Again, there's variety within those categories. So before I go into the detail, let me take a short break.